Today, we're going to discuss email security, complexities of email attacks, then challenges that businesses face as a result, and the impact of AI as an attack tool, and how an ad tech mindset was used to defend against these attacks using behavioural analytics. So let's go. Hello everyone and welcome to another session of Threatcast from Threatscape. Today I'm delighted to be joined today by friend and colleague at this stage, Dave Lomax. Welcome Dave. Dave has 20 years experience in cybersecurity. He's worked with myself and colleagues in Threatscape for almost 10 years now. He's worked in Silicon Valley for 6 years and then returned to head up an EMEA role in a number of cutting edge startup organizations, which is where Dave and I first met many years ago. So Dave, welcome to Threatcast.
Thank you, Colin. Great to be here. Appreciate your time.
Not at all. So listen, we get straight into it, Dave. Email. You often talk to organizations and 70-80% of their IP is sitting on their email systems and many of them don't realize that. But what are the most common email security threats that companies face today?
Big question. Yeah, thank you. I think if you take it from the start, right, I think Deloitte says 91% of all breaches start in some form in email. So the vast majority of them now, this is an easy route into organizations' businesses, right? Whether it's just to get into email or just to pivot from email into some other part of the network, right? They might be using that as a pivot point to get into your organization. Phishing emails are definitely the big ones we see a lot of. That could also be compounded with invoice fraud or vendor fraud, right? So you've got people impersonating to be potentially one of your suppliers, or they're trying to get you to send them a product. They're interested in your product to do that. So I'd say that the vast majority is going to be somewhere in that realm where you're going to see a lot of phishing emails. We're obviously seeing now with the onslaught of generative AI and things like that, there's tooling out there, right? You can go to the dark web, things like Caffeine, and they do phishing as a service, right? You can say, I want to go after Colin at Threatscape, and they're going to find out all the information they can about you and make it very tangible when you get these emails. You know, we see people trying to get into the way the business operates to try and really replicate what they expect. You know, often you'll see the most benign emails coming in going, can you tell us how much money we owe you? Of course, every company wants to say how much money they owe them. So often that's a good starting point for them to gather all that information to know, I know company A owes company B, who owes company C. How do I get in the middle of that? So I say
more into the phishing. When we talk about phishing, because some people, they get a little bit confused maybe about what is phishing about, but really it's smart social engineering, really, isn't it?
Yeah. They're basically, you know, we all put too much about ourselves on the internet, right? And some of it we need to do, right? You and I will be doing a lot of LinkedIn, so people know a lot about where we are and what we're doing at any given time. But yeah, they're very much trying to make it sound very credible. Email they're sending you going, you know, we actually at Abnormal we created a bit of code that was using ChatGPT, went off and said, hey, go and target our VP of Asia Pacific. And it went out and it didn't create the email, but it gave us the details, right? Hey, Tim was speaking at this event. He was talking about this topic on this date. These were the people that were there. So we could easily fashion an email that went, hey, Tim, really appreciate what you were talking about here. Bit of bigging him up. Should have more thought leaders like you in the industry. I'm writing a white paper. Maybe click this link and tell me what you think. Right. So that socially engineered stuff is getting better and better all the time, making them credible, making them think we should open or click the link.
So how do we defend against that? I mean, that's a mammoth task. You're talking about AI, and we did a Threatcast on AI some months back. But I mean, it's supposed to be good for us, and yet it's bringing all of these challenges and making it more and more difficult to defend against.
Yeah, it is getting much harder, right? And it's taking those different approaches, right? If you think about traditional secure email gateway tools, which are really what we've had for the longest time, I liken these two technologies to a bit like how the endpoint evolution has happened over the years, right? We had SEGs were very much that MTA, they were mail transport. The email came along, they take it off the conveyor belt, and they look for known bad stuff, right? Bad links, bad DKIM, all this kind of stuff, sender authentication frameworks. Are they on a block list? All that kind of stuff, which if you think about now, we don't do that on our endpoint, right? Endpoints are rarely use just signatures, right? The problem with signatures are it's a bit like looking for a car accident in your rearview mirror. This happened yesterday, right? Most of us many years ago went from an endpoint perspective, we shouldn't care what it is. We should care what it's doing, which is how things like these new EDR platforms have now evolved, right? They're very much behavioral based. Now, doing that in email, don't get me wrong, is a lot harder, right? There's only so many instruction sets in a computer that can do so many things. How you and I communicate over email, how I communicate with customers, suppliers, and things like that is going to be very different. So you need to be very clever of what you're doing, right? A good chunk of the founders that are normal didn't weirdly come from a security background. They came from an ad tech. Now, if you think about it, if you want someone that's going to look at a block of text and go, what's the intent of this message? You want those people that were trying to sell us a new car, a new watch, or a new holiday, right? So it's moving email from the known bad into this behavioral based stance, right? Understanding what normal looks like in your environment. Then you can find these diamonds in the rough.
Yeah, so separating the wheat from the chaff, as they say. You mentioned DKIM there, and again, this is another area where I think a lot of, and we've seen it with the organizations when we carry out audits, DKIM, FD mark. And how do these work together to secure your email domain?
Yeah, they can be incredibly useful. And if you think about it, this DKIM and SPF, right, they've been around for a long time. What you started out with SPF was going, I'll tell you, I'll always send my emails from here, right? These IP addresses are where I'm going to send my emails from, which is a great thing, right? It made it much harder to spoof emails coming out from that perspective. Then we evolved that into DKIM, where we're going to sign the emails. We're going to say, this has definitely come from us. You don't necessarily need to worry about the IP address, but it's definitely come from us because we're signing it. And then we've got DMARC, right, which is getting much better. Combination of those things, which is basically we're saying we shouldn't be receiving emails unless they're following all the sender authentication frameworks. The real problem with a lot of that is, while it's great and all senders should be using it to stop them being spoofed, what it doesn't do is stop your inbound problem, right? Because the vast majority of these attacks might come from a Gmail, a Hotmail, an Apple account, right? All valid senders, all perfectly allowed to send you, and will pass SPF, DKIM, and DMARC every single time. It won't obviously protect you against a supplier that's compromised, right? If someone that was selling to yourselves, Colin, had their email compromised and then sent you one in saying, hey, if you pay your invoices by the end of the week, we're knocking 5% off, that email will be coming from that sender, right? Perfectly valid. So they are great things for organizations to be using, but they're not great in protecting you against these attacks coming in because, as much as we like to call them script kiddies and things like this, these attackers, these are smart people. Some of this is organized crime. They're not stupid. They know that people are looking for those sorts of things. So they're just not going to get caught by that trap.
So it kind of leads me on to email encryption then, because we think, oh, well, it's encrypted, it's going to be safe. But there are pros and cons. I mean, the complexities of setting it up and with the email gateways and so on. What are your thoughts around, the benefits of email encryption versus the cons are the challenges or limitations around email encryption?
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword with encryption, right? So absolutely, like if you're doing confidential communications, you need to either ship IP or whatever it might be between known senders. Encryption's a really good thing to do. Now, think of this as like your WhatsApp, right? The end-to-end stuff is very different to just email encryption. So what I mean by that is if I'm definitely sending you an email, you and I will do the key exchange, and we know that my client sent it to your client and only you can unencrypt it. If you look at a TLS or a transport type encryption layer, it's a very different game. It's a bit like when people said, oh, I've got a padlock in my browser, it's secure. No, it just means the attack is now going to go over an encrypted link, right? People's websites were still being compromised, even though they had SSL on it, because they were using these attacks over that encrypted link. So it's absolutely a great tool for those secure communications when you're sending and you're truly using end-to-end encryption. But just seeing TLS encryption across your links, while it's a good thing to do to stop people intercepting it, it's not going to protect you against some of these malicious attacks, certainly inbound ones.
So what role then? I mean, email is just another tool around encryption is another tool around securing email. What roles do email gateways and firewalls play in email security?
Yeah, they can do a couple of things in there, right? So typically, if you're smart now, and this has changed dramatically, right? So when you're on-prem and things like that, you could use your firewall to do some really clever things around it, making sure it only allowed it encrypted SMTP, or you would only allow emails to be sent from certain relays, for example. The vast majority of us now, and you really can't with Microsoft, they're not using on-prem, right? So it's not your firewall. It's Microsoft's firewall in there as your platform. So there's still a role for it, and some people probably do have some on-prem servers that make sense, but firewalling isn't really now that involved in email, if that makes sense, because it's no longer going to your data center or your email server. So they are useful, but I think, we're now heavily dependent on making sure that, let's face it, right? It's M365 or Google Workspace. These are the big players out there. And, quite frankly, they do great things, right? They're all going to be SOC 2 Type 2 compliant data centers. They're all going to be covering all the latest NIST compliance things they need to do from a security perspective. So often for certainly small and medium businesses, you're probably getting better security for your mail server than you did when you had to try and protect it yourself. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I get it. So how do we mitigate? I mean, you mentioned there about invoice fraud. We get into deep fakes and AI and all that stuff in a little bit. But how do we identify and mitigate, say, a business email compromise? What are your guidance around that?
Yeah, so in terms of business email compromise, they are getting more advanced day by day, right? The attackers are pivoting regularly to change the way they do things. It's very difficult using a traditional approach to detect some of these things. Now, if you think about what we've been told for years is, right, the phishing simulation was the big thing, right? Train people to block these things. And I'm not saying don't do phishing simulation, right? It's a really useful thing to do to get people more wary to think about these things. There's a couple of things around that in terms of training your staff is, and if you look at the stats worldwide, right, across all organizations, now every company is going to have a better or worse score than this, but around about 20% of people still click the link worldwide, right? No matter how well you train them. So we've sort of reached the level of, we know we've gotten to this point, getting them further is going to be harder. So it's not that I'm saying don't use phishing simulation. I'm saying you can't rely on it, right? You can use that as a baseline to train people. But, I also say with all humility, right, there's 100% emails I've seen that I would have gone, that looks legitimate. I was with a POV with a customer, invoice fraud came in. We alerted them to it. The SOC team and the finance team all disagreed and told us we got this wrong. It wasn't until we got their supplier on the phone and they went, we didn't send that email. It's got nothing to do with us, that they went, okay, we just got it wrong, right? So, we're talking about large enterprise organizations where even their SOC team and finance team can get these things wrong. So they are incredibly complicated. It's not that simple. What's really important is to be using tools like Abnormal and others where you're very aware of what normal looks like in that environment. So you can look from those deviations from normal business practices, right? Like I said earlier, just asking people, how much money do we owe you? Can you send us your outstanding invoices? Well, that seems quite benign. That gives these attackers an awful lot of information about you. A simple BEC we've seen, and it's been going on for a long time now, is payroll fraud, right? If you've just joined an organization, no one in HR would have any idea that c13469@gmail.com isn't Colin, right? It's just that's the email I've got. It's hard to get my name anymore. So you send an email in going, just joined the organization. I can't update my payroll, but mortgage is coming out at the end of the month. I need to change it. Chances are, they were for a while. People were changing bank details and payroll were getting paid into the wrong place. I think people are tightening up on things like that. But I had a good example of that very recently where they went, oh yeah, no, see, we wouldn't do this. And the response back from the finance team was, hey, you need to use this link. This is the portal to do your payroll. And payroll gets run on this day, so you must be done before then. And they're like, see, they did the right thing. I said, yeah, but you've now given that attacker 2 very valuable bits of information. If I were smart, I'm going to reply a day before the payroll cutoff saying, I've tried this link. I can't log in. Please, can you do it manually? Because again, to the socially engineered stuff we were talking about, it's very credible at that.
So what role does the artificial intelligence and the machine learning play in kind of detecting these threats?
Yeah, good question. So, you and I have worked in various companies right now that have been doing AI and things like that. If you speak to any data scientist, the first thing they'll tell you is, I'll build you a really high efficacy model if you give me a lot of well-structured, well-labeled data. If you've got a lot of data that isn't particularly well-structured or there isn't enough data to learn on, you're not going to get that fidelity. So that was always hard in the seg world, right? You only saw emails in that instance as they came off the conveyor belt. You looked at them. You didn't know if it was a known supplier. You don't know if they typically talk to these people. There's lots of data you just don't have. As everything's now moved to cloud email, whether it be Microsoft or Google for that example, now you have everything, right? You can use these advanced APIs, which is how we interact with them, where you see internal traffic, external traffic, incoming traffic. You see sign-in events. You see mail filter rules being made. Abnormal alone is looking at over 40,000 touch proof points in every email, right? That's when you can give the very high efficacy detections and you can learn so much. So, I've said for years, right, with all AI, your mileage may vary, but you need data scientists that get the subject matter and can actually provide you those high efficacy models. But it all depends on data.
You talk about, so volume of data, more data we have, good or bad, we can filter out what becomes normal. You mentioned there 40,000 touch points. I'm like, Jesus, where does this stop? I mean, is the next generation of email, email security going to be 80,000 detection points? Where do you get the balance on it, I guess?
Yeah, you've got, with everything that's machine learning and AI based, right, you have to be very careful with these things, right? If you take it at its simplest form, if you go back, Christ, I'm showing age here now, you go back 15 years, right? You look at the old spam days, there was Spam Assassin, things like that, right? They were using Bayesian estimation. Cambridge algorithm, very much about what's the probability of X being Y, right? And what the attackers realized very quickly is, and there was a term called Bayes poisoning, which meant you could send a load of good-ish emails, but it was so much data that it tuned the algorithm down to think, well, this is normal. And then you send a batch of really bad stuff and it would go straight through. So it's really important with any AI, and we hear this with European Union talking about AI controls, it's safeguarding around the AI not getting damaged, poisoned, and in some way made to do nefarious things you wouldn't. So that's the really important thing, is it's got to be used as a scalpel as opposed to a sledgehammer when you're looking at these things. To your point, right, 40,000 is often the minimum we're looking at. It can well go up to 90,000 points depending on what data we have about that type of environment and that individual. So it is really important to have all those data points, but it's also really important to make sure that people building these models don't just rely on one thing. AI at its essence is machine learning underneath, right? But it's using recursive neural networks, deep learning. It can be using Bayesian still in some instances, K-means clustering, right? It's using all those building blocks to give you the best results for what you want.
Yeah, and I think you and I discussed this in the past. How I write an email. So I don't say, "Good day, Dave." I say, "Hi, Dave," to you. I won't go, "Hi, hello, David." So it's picking up how I write my emails to you, how I write my emails to another partner, customer, and so on. And that's one thing. So maybe my grammar as well, then it's picking up. But is it picking up, if I typically have 2 paragraphs in an email or 3 paragraphs, the physical structure almost. Like it's getting into an awful lot to try and analyze that Colin is sending an email to Dave, and this is actually from him to the right person with proper content. But how to pick up can you give us an example, I suppose, if I'm really smart and I've really got to know you and I know what Colin writes and how he typically writes, so I'm going to circumvent that, but then I can get you. Have you got an example you could share with our listeners? Yeah,
there's a couple of things around that. One topic I'll bring up on that one first is a lot of people talk about the Grammarly's, the generative AI creating emails, right? I could feed, in theory, a load of emails you and I have corresponded over with, and it'll mimic that, right? The interesting thing with that is it's also very easy to flip that on its head and use generative AI to say, what's the probability this email was made by generative AI? And it can very accurately, now we do this in some of our models, it'll go back and you can overlay and you can see green is what you're pretty sure AI would have generated. Red might be some things they would adapt evenly. And you can very quickly, with high efficacy, detect some of these things that are being created with generative AI, right? So it's not that hard. You probably see in the news, like teachers are now seeing more and more students trying to plagiarize their documents going in by making it look like they've done it, but it's generative AI, right? There are telltale signs that can quickly do that and understand that. But it's important, like you said, if you look at the founders that started Abnormal back in the day, right? They were looking at what do we use. At our heart as a company, right, we're a human behavioral data science organization. Right? We manifest that in email and a few other areas right now. But how did we use, and what their point was, how do we take this really good data science stuff we know about humans and use it usefully? And early doors, an investor was like, look, I've recently had my financial PA has come up to me and said, you've just sent me an email saying we're investing 10 million in this organization. Are you sure? And he went, absolutely not. But first, tell me why you think it isn't me. And she went, well, we don't use that bank. I've never heard you talk about that company. You don't send emails like this. I just didn't think it was you. And he said to Sandy, one of the founders, do that. Make a product that knows what she knows about me that can do that. And that's basically a lot of the genesis of the organization, right? We've used that data science, that behavioral analytics to understand what it looks like in your organization, how you conduct yourself and how you conduct your business.
That's all about, let's say, trying to prevent it, but let's assume the proverbial has hit the fan.
Yep.
What should an organization do when it realizes, okay, we've got a breach? How should an organization respond?
Yeah, and that's a good thing, right? Us at Abnormal, right? We're not perfect, right? We're not going to get everything, right? We think we're as good as it can get, right? We get most of these things but you're always going to get something, or it may come through in a different form, right? Maybe it didn't come through an email. So you really do need to belt and braces that. We actually, part of our product has got what we call ATO, which is account takeover, right? So let's assume a phishing attack got past. Maybe it was on a mobile device we didn't see, or something strange happened, whatever it may be, but it's being compromised. It's being able to then look at those other signals in things like sign-in events, other SaaS applications, right? That suddenly, Colin's signed in a weird location, which can be very noisy in Microsoft, don't get me wrong. But then you can leverage other insights about an individual. Well, I know Colin doesn't send emails from this location, right? He's never been to that, or he's never sent emails to that location. And also, I now see he's in Workday extracting a load of this data. He doesn't normally do that as well. So it's very important to better see all of it, right? We've talked about the MITRE framework for a long time, right? It's the attack, the lateral, the exploitation, all of these things that go through, they have to follow those certain steps. So making sure that if a compromise does get beyond email, are you sure you've got that account locked down, right? Do you know everything about that account so you could stop it at that level? Are you looking at all these other applications they might be using so you can look for that nefarious behavior somewhere else as well?
Okay, interesting. So let's look at, say, I've got an opportunity to enhance my security around email. I'm a CISO. I'm going, okay, what should I look for? What are the key things in evaluating out of email security providers?
Yeah, really good question. I've recently been here, we're growing gangbusters at the moment. I'm doing a lot of interviewing recently, and a few people have said similar to me, is going, why abnormal? Why do this? And I think one of the things in email, right, is it's a very fundamental technology. Nobody wants to break it, right? So all CISOs have talked to me have gone, we're not going to change our sec. It's a nightmare, right? If we take that out, we break email, everyone's shouting at me. And I liken the way we do things a lot to, if you remember back in the day with Palo Alto, right? Next generation firewalls come along. You go to a company that's an enterprise level and go, hey, can you test this new firewall? No, I'm not ripping this out of my network. I might try and do it in a small environment over here, but I'm not doing it. And they were really smart. They went, no, it's fine. Do a span port on your switch, plug it into our firewall, and we'll tell you what it's not doing. Yeah. Completely non-disruptive to the environment, but very informative to CISOs. It's really important you do that the same way with email, right? Because we're especially going in via API, you can leave your seg, you can leave Microsoft, you can leave Google doing all the security they're telling you is enough. We can and will only show you bad things that are landing in your inbox. So I would say, be very cognizant when you're testing vendors, right? How do I make this easy on me? How do I make it non-disruptive? I certainly don't want to break my environment. There are lots of email providers out there that sort of say they do it via the API, but actually they'll end up getting you to put transport rules into your O365, which, okay, maybe that's a way you could do it. But it also means if you send an email over a transport rule and their network's down, you don't have email again, right? So you've got that single point of failure. At worst, if you're using an API solution, if it goes down, you just don't get that protection for it.
The next gen firewall, we've got the next gen seg, although I'd argue, well, can you still call it next gen? It's fifth gen now, isn't it? Whatever they call it. Go back a little, we'll step back. Sandboxing and URL scanning, what role does that play in kind of modern email, as a modern email security tool?
Yeah,
because they've been around for quite a while.
Yeah, no, and I think they still have some value, right? And I would say URL rewriting, things like that, it can be useful to know if people did click on those things. As I said at the start, right, I could teach you in 5 minutes to use some of these phishing tools where it sends out, every email it sends out has a unique link, a unique attachment, whatever. Sandboxing things didn't work. Go back just not that long ago, but a while back with WannaCry, right? We all heard in the news that they found a kill switch. They didn't find a kill switch. The virus was designed in a way that it would, if it was in a sandbox, it would request the domain that didn't exist. And a sandbox will always give you an IP address back for that DNS server. And then it went, oh, that can't be right, because that should come back as a fail. I don't have an IP for that. So it would go, I'm in a sandbox, don't do anything bad. Again, like DMARC, DKIM, and all the things we talked about in email, sandboxing can be effective, but these attackers are being very smart to make sure they detect if they're in a sandbox so they don't do anything bad in that environment. The same with links, right? They'll be nested, or they'll be perfectly valid links. It might be on a SharePoint or a Dropbox or something like that, right? They're going to use, and they deliberately do, again, to the point I said at the start, they will use known names, because if you get an email saying you've got a document from DocuSign and you use DocuSign, perfectly valid, right? So you're going to think this must be fine. But then inside that is another bad link. So I think they have their place. But again, it's back to that known bad, its signature approach. It's just not particularly effective. We shouldn't care what the attachment is and what the link is. We care about what's the intent. Why would I click this link? Why would I open this attachment?
Okay, I just want to shift it up a gear. One of the things with policy, regulation, compliance, all that good stuff, GRC, NIS2 came out, went live October 18th, if memory serves me. Obviously applies to any organization in Europe if they qualify based on turnover, industry, headcount, and so on. And it applies too for any organization in the UK who's doing business with a European organization. So how do we ensure that email security policies do comply with the likes of NIS2 or other industry standards?
Yeah, it is important, right? Most of us, certainly in the advanced email security, we should be complying with all of those, right? Most of us do.
Yeah.
And a lot of them, with all of those rules-based, are very, if you look at a few of them, right, they're always like, some of the lines will be, you must do the utmost level of protection against your users or your data or things like that, right? They never actually spell out what that actually means, but it's like you have to be able to plausibly defend. If you did have a compromise, you did as much as you possibly could to protect yourselves. So I think that's sort of a CISO's role is, if you think about it, you may not always be able to get the best in breed and everything, right? But you definitely need to be showing that you're putting the company forward. You're very aware of all your compliance regulations and what you need as an organization. And you've done your due diligence, right? You've put tooling in place to protect users, protect your company IP, and protect against things like breaches and compromises. So I think it's really important that the CISOs are thinking around those things. When it comes to compliance, have I got all the right tooling in place? Which means, I'm at least reaching it to the level that is expected of those things. A lot of them are just based on policies, right? If you get all the NIST things that have been out there for the longest time, really it's coming down to some basic but very simple things that we should all be doing well of, right? And if you're securing some really complex cloud environments, right, it's not always that easy, right? You have to be very cognizant that, the best thing I should be doing is this and that. It's not as simple as just saying big passwords and all the rest of it, right? You've got the latest firewalls. So it's such a big conversation, that one. I just think CISO should be just doing their due diligence to make sure at least the tooling they're put in place puts them where they need to be.
I'm conscious of time we're reaching. So looking through the crystal ball, all right, what are the emerging threats that you guys are seeing now, and how can organizations prepare for them? And then I want to throw one more in around AI. Can you address that one first for me, please?
The threads we see very much are that attackers are trying to mimic and make you think this is coming from a good sender, right? So a lot of these attacks are coming from pretending to be Microsoft, DocuSign, Box, Dropbox, whatever it might be, right? So I think we'll see more of that. There was a great evolution. QR codes were a big thing about a year ago, right? People were all saying QR codes is a real problem. There was two examples I wish to show. One was a QR code, and then one was the DocuSign one, which had a link. And they looked, obviously the people that made this hack went, QR codes work really well. So suddenly this DocuSign one morphed into not having a link in it, but having a QR code. So you got to scan it on your phone to get the link, which meant anyone doing these URL checks we talked about earlier, never going to see it now. Yeah. So I think there's going to be a constant evolution and morphing of the types of threats we're seeing now to make them more effective. If you look at some of these phishing as service tools out there, they have like genuine tool analytics, right? How many people opened in? What geolocation? What were they doing, right? They can get the same sort of marketing stuff we get out of Google based on a threat campaign they've sent out. So they're constantly evolving these attacks.
And I think it's really interesting. You touched on earlier, Sandy, on the founders of Abnormal. They came from the ad tech background. And that's one of the things that really fascinated me in the early days when we got together. Try and block so much when it comes to watching TV. You skip the ads. It's everything you want to avoid. So the intelligence behind it about how do they track and trap and then stop everything. So, for me, in the early days of email compromise and our relationship with Abnormal, it was very much around the AI and ML, and it was all, the latest buzz and trending. That's still continuing. And clearly AI, it's just exploding. And I'm delighted to see there are more controls and regulations being brought in to keep a leash on it as such. I do believe it's very good for business, and healthcare had massive benefits and so on. But we're also seeing, obviously, and you've discussed it, the way AI impacts and threats. What's your view, again, crystal ball? How do you see AI being used from an email attack and a defense perspective in the next 5 to 10 years? We know what it's like in the next 3 to 5. That's why I'm asking you, crystal ball.
Yeah, I think there's a propensity that we're going to see more AI-based attacks, right? It's going to get better. Most of us in the security world will tell you right now, we're not seeing a huge amount of them. And for the simple reason, it's too easy doing it the way they're doing it right now, right? They can be very effective without having to use all these AI tools and retool themselves to use them. It's 100% coming. I guarantee nation states are using it already, right? If nothing more than, like I said at the start, collecting the data. Go and find me everything on Colin, right? Go and find me everything on David. How do I know these things? So I think we'll definitely see a bigger use of AI by our adversaries, right? There's going to be more of that being used. Very hard to see where that's going, right? The generative AI platforms, the chat GPTs and things like that, they're getting better every day, right? They are being used for more things. So I 100% expect to see, if you think about threats right now, right, most of the phishing people think if it lasts 24 hours, I've had a good day. So what will end up being is going, we want something that's going to last an hour, 2 hours, sort of thing, just how quickly can we get them out the door that works? So the volume is getting bigger, and I think that's only going to get bigger. So if you think about the fact they're automating the outbound attacks, we are going to have to get better at automating the inbound attacks, because teams that already are using legacy technologies, the socks are creaking at the seams, right? I think it was a 600% increase in phishing in the last year, right? 10 years down the line, it's going to be a much bigger problem. So those people who haven't embraced AI to do these things, I think, are going to have problems.
So while tech is certainly going to play a key role, we still have to rely on people and processes. It's, the humans can often be the weakest link. Dave, I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you very much for your time today. Lovely to see you as always, and love to have you back in a few months as a guest on Threatcast again. Thank you all for listening today, and I hope you all have a very good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.